All right, everybody. Hello. So happy, I think it's Wednesday. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a concept that builds on the videos from yesterday. And this concept is called bad faith. And it's an interesting and challenging concept that Sartre gives us. And it comes from his book, Being in Nothingness. Okay? And bad faith, again, kind of is in response to everything that we worked through yesterday. Okay? So we think about kind of, for Sartre, everything's a choice. Okay? And that includes not choosing, because when you don't choose something, you're still choosing not to choose something. So again, choice is inescapable. Okay? Choice is inescapable. But when we try to escape choice, or when we deny responsibility, we're acting in what Sartre calls bad faith. Okay? And so bad faith is a response, or sometimes a almost, it's either, it can be both willful, it can also be kind of subconscious, but bad faith is a central aspect as it relates to how do we respond to everything that we talked about yesterday. Okay? This long list, this scope of responsibilities, okay? The fact that everything's a choice, and that the primary condition of our human existence is freedom. And what are we free to do? We're free to make choices. And what are we responsible to? The choices that we make. So that means that, again, we can never escape choice. We can never escape. We can never escape choice. And therefore, we can never escape responsibility. But boy, do we try, right? Boy, do we try to escape responsibility. Okay? And when we try to either deny responsibility, escape responsibility, put responsibility on somewhere or something else, someone else, we're acting in what Sartre calls bad faith. Okay? We act in bad faith, according to Sartre, when, again, we think we have no choice, when we place responsibility elsewhere, when we assume that we can't choose otherwise. And this idea of bad faith being, again, something to be avoided. Okay? And so bad faith is this position, and it's like an attitude. And again, Sartre is not a religious person, far from it. And so the word faith is kind of maybe a bit misleading because it has no religious connotation at all. I like to think of it more as an attitude. Okay? And bad faith, again, is an interesting kind of place. It's an interesting position that we find ourselves in. And sometimes it's kind of unavoidable, right? We all act in bad faith often, right? If not, maybe every day to some capacity. Okay? And so according to Sartre, we are to avoid bad faith and try to embrace living in good faith, right? And I would say that living in good faith is to live authentically, okay? And so if bad faith is denying responsibility, denying choice, if bad faith is making excuses, right? And we love making excuses, don't we? Right? We love making excuses. We love putting our responsibility on something else, on someone else, on anything other than us. We don't want that responsibility, right? But when we do that, we act in what Sartre calls bad faith. Okay? Acting in good faith would be taking responsibility properly on board, recognizing our choice in everything, right? And what this does, it goes all the way back to our starting place on Monday. That potentially, by taking greater possession of, by taking greater responsibility, by recognizing how everything's a choice, there is this hope, that we can take greater possession of self, which is a fundamental aspect of existentialist philosophy. So here's a couple of examples of bad faith, just to, again, paint the picture a little bit more clear. Okay? So let's imagine, for instance, hear me out. I know that none of you have ever done something similar to this. So let's say you're taking organic chemistry. I feel bad for you. Okay? You're taking organic chemistry. It's a hard class, notoriously challenging, right? But let's say you're thinking about trying to go to med school or PA school or something like that. And so like you have to take organic chemistry. Okay? And you know that there's going to be a really hard midterm. Like it's in the syllabus. You know that the midterm is going to be challenging. The professor indicates how it's challenging, right? Former students your friends that have taken this class have said that the midterm is challenging. And so you know it's coming up. Okay? You're very, very well aware of this challenging component of a particular class. Okay? Midterm's coming up, you're kind of studying, you're hanging around with like a CB, not like a CB radio, but like you have a C, kind of bordering on a B, like you're in the mix, but you're not doing great. Okay? Midterm's coming up, midterm's coming up, midterm's coming up. You should study. Oh, I have to go study. Oh, I have to go study. You study a little bit, but not awesome. And then, lo and behold, just because this is how the universe works sometimes, the night before the exam, come to find out it's one of your best friend's 21st birthday. Oof. Classic college conundrum. Okay? What do you do? Because you're like, I know that we'll be out late, we'll be out celebrating, I'll be maybe a little roughed up in the morning, a little hungover, so I should probably stay in. Maybe I'll just go for one and then like I'll go home, right? But clearly, you go out, you make the choice to go out with your friends, right? You start drinking, you're like, I should stop. You keep drinking, right? You're making the choice to keep drinking, right? And you have a great night. You have a lot of fun, okay? You wake up, you're not feeling great, you're not feeling that sharp, okay? You go to the exam, and you bomb it. Like you do really, really terribly, right? You do really terribly. It affects your grade, drops you down to a D. There's no way of you making it up, so you pass the class, but you get a D. You go home for the summer, for fall break or whatever, and your parents, ask you about your grades, and you're like, well, I got a D in organic chemistry. Well, what kind of tale do you tell to your parents? Do you own up to the choices that you made, which was a lack of studying, which was going out for a 21 run the night before the exam, for you continuing to drink on the night of the 21 run the night before the exam? Or do you say something like the following? Yeah, I got a D because, that class is just so hard and the professor's just so hard. Everybody does terrible, right? We had this really hard midterm. Like I knew it was coming. Like I studied a decent amount. You fully leave out the fact that you went out the night before, right? And you're like, everybody did terrible on the exam. Like the teacher's notoriously hard. Like she makes the exams just really, really difficult on purpose. That whole instance, if you do something like that, or if you've known a friend to do something like that, that is all bad faith. That is all bad faith, right? Because what you're doing at every step of the way there, you are putting responsibility on anything and everything that isn't you, right? And that, again, is not taking choice. It's not taking responsibility properly on board, okay? And so this idea of and we can think of other scenarios that kind of work within that space. We can think of other, examples that demonstrate bad faith, right? If you're in a job that you really dislike, right? Maybe the coworkers aren't that friendly. Maybe the management or the bosses aren't that kind, or maybe just the work is fairly unfulfilling, and you stay in that job because you think you have no choice, right? And I know it's easier said than done, but that's acting in bad faith, right? The fact that, again, you tell yourself, well, I have to keep this job just because like there's not many other options. I don't want to try to look for a new job, right? Like that's acting in bad faith. Because again, there's other possibilities out there. It might be tough to find one for sure, right? You might not, again, get one immediately, but you can always try, right? And that's Sartre's kind of like unrelenting point, is the fact that we find ourselves in bad faith when we foreclose other possibilities. We find ourselves in bad faith when we don't recognize that there's always a choice. Okay? And again, one way of thinking about bad faith is whenever we make excuses. Okay? And so one thing that I always like to tell my class, and this is something that I do legitimately strive for in my own life, right? Because if, again, acting in bad faith is living, I would say, inauthentically, because you're not taking greater possession of self and your choices and your freedom, right? Then acting in good faith is living more authentically, right? So a question of like, how do we live potentially in good faith? How do we live authentically? Well, I think one way, which is very difficult to do, one way to do that is to recognize when and where and why we make excuses. And I think we make excuses in a very kind of veiled, almost, and maybe not excuse, but I think that a way of thinking about bad faith in an interesting way is to connect it to what I call like the have-tos. Okay? So I have to go to work, right? I have to turn in this assignment. I have to major in this particular thing. I have to go to the gym, right? Sartre claims you don't have to do any of that, right? It's all a choice, okay? So I would encourage you, and this again, kind of like move to take greater possession of self, to try to take greater possession of your existence, is that anytime you have the inclination to say, oh, I have to, change it ever so slightly to I am choosing to. Okay? And I mean this very seriously. Like, try it. It's weird. It sounds weird. Especially if you say it out loud and people are like, what the hell are you talking about? Right? Because we just don't operate that way. We don't collectively kind of agree with maybe that way of thinking. But I encourage you to try it, right? I am choosing to watch this video. I am choosing to do this assignment. I'm choosing to go to work even though I maybe don't like it. I'm choosing to continue to major in something that I find unfulfilling. Or I am choosing to major in something that I find really fulfilling. Right? So this idea of kind of like changing the have-tos to the I am choosing to, I really do think is kind of a radical move that can, in a very real way, help us avoid bad faith. Okay? And so I encourage you all to try that. There's a couple of other videos underneath here, I think maybe just one or two, for us to kind of really fully understand what bad faith is and how to potentially avoid it, to again try to take greater possession of self, to live a life that is ours, connected to others in real, meaningful, and fulfilling ways. Cheers.